Hey 5202. I hope you're all having a good weekend and are staying safe. As you can probably tell by the screen, we're going to be doing something a little bit different today. We're playing The Sims while we discuss space and place. Or rather, I'm going to play The Sims while you listen to me go on about it. So originally my activity this week was to have you guys actually design some sort of teaching space in your discussion groups. But since I'm trying to make the activities a little less intensive, I thought I would just give you an example of this myself. Plus, this honestly just seemed like a great excuse to play The Sims. So I've started a little maternity unit here, and as I talk, I'm going to be building some teaching spaces. So this semester, we've covered a lot of topics. We started off by discussing different learning theories and their application to teaching strategies, and we also talked about planning for teaching. We then covered a number of different teaching strategies, and last week we talked about interprofessional education. And a recurring theme that I hope you've taken away from this is that learning is highly social. As our foundational reading this week discusses, a lot of times in medical and health professions education, we talk about education as being something isolated to the learner, but learning does not occur in a vacuum. It's highly social. So think back to some of our earlier discussions about social constructivism and communities of practice. And this week I want to talk a bit about where teaching and learning takes place. So we're going to be talking about space and place. So as many of us have experienced as educators, the physical environment of the space can really drive our teaching. So consider some of the more interactive, small group-oriented teaching strategies we've discussed this semester. So like PBL, role-play, simulation. It's difficult as an educator to use these sorts of teaching strategies when we're constrained by the architecture of a lecture theater where the furniture is often bolted down to the ground. It's also important to recognize that spaces and buildings aren't just background settings or neutral backdrops. They are filled with people acting out their lives, and they have an impact on the behaviors and learning that occurs. For example, the layout of a hospital unit impacts the relationships and interactions between healthcare professionals and their patients. And this brings us to place. Place can have many meanings. It can be understood as a specific space, a social setting, or geographic setting, but really what sets it apart from space is that it's more than just material form. It's the meaning and value that people associate with it and attach to it. So Habeck gives the example of a home. Your home is more than just a building. So place is that interaction and negotiation between people and the built environment. And as such, place is constantly being reconstructed. So while place is studied with regards to meaning for people, space is looking at quantifiable attributes and patterns. So as we're talking about how people learn and how we can teach them, let's consider where our learners are learning. And how does this place impact what is learned, valued, and even put into practice? So where does learning occur? Well, let's consider it for a moment in terms of the various types of curriculum. So first off, we have formal curriculum, and this includes our learning objectives, our scheduled learning time, tests, things like that. We have distinct spaces and time periods for the formal curriculum, like classrooms and lecture halls. We also have informal curriculum, which contains a lot of the unscripted and ad hoc kind of teaching and learning that occurs. So in health professions education, a lot of this occurs in hallways, on the unit, at the nursing station. And this learning also occurs in social spaces such as the cafeteria and staff room. And these informal spaces where students can continue to learn beyond the classroom are really important, and they can also break up formal hierarchies. And then lastly, there's hidden curriculum. Those lessons, unarticulated and unexplored, that we transmit to our students. For example, the values, beliefs, and norms. We transmit these both in formal learning spaces and also in the social environments that our students are in. For example, in the hallways, not only is a lot of informal curriculum taught, but there's also a lot of hidden curriculum that's being transmitted to our students as well. For those of you who teach in the workplace, for example, precepting nursing students, you aren't just teaching clinical skills and knowledge. You're also socializing your students into the social and professional relationships that occur within the workplace. And in clinical teaching, it's actually pretty rare for learning and teaching to occur in specifically educationally designated spaces. So a lot of the teaching that you all are doing are occurring at the bedside, in the clinic, at the nursing station, etc. And as many of you have previously reflected on, these contexts can be really challenging to teach in, because you're trying to teach in a context where the primary purpose is the delivery of safe patient care. So for those of you who teach clinically, you're constantly confronted with the challenge of trying to create spaces that can be sustainably shared by both clinical and educational activities. And for the teachers in the class, I would love to hear your take on this. What has your experience been? How do you experience socializing teacher candidates into your workplace? And do you find there's also a tension or a challenge present in ensuring their learning in a context where the primary purpose is the education of children? So one of the things I wanted to have in our little hospital here was a dedicated space for students. And I really liked Doneto's description of community learning hubs for healthcare students. So one of the study sites here described having a hub room which was designated as protected space for students where they could get away to reflect, learn, and share experiences. Interestingly, students here didn't use the space often beyond the first few weeks. They liked that it had things like journals for them, but they thought it could be improved with things like a better desk, actually having a computer with the internet. So I included that in the build here. I also wanted to have a dedicated space for quiet study and one for more social interactions. I've also put the room close to the nursing station and staff room so they're within proximity to experienced practitioners while also giving them this dedicated safe space. And the Hawick article gives us an idea of why having a space like this could be important. So for those of you who didn't read this one, the study discusses a new medical school that was built on a healthcare campus which also had a number of hospital buildings there. And there were a lot of pros and cons to this. So while this did help some students feel more like they were part of the medical community, some also felt like they couldn't be just university students. Some felt pressure to conduct themselves in a manner that they felt was expected by other healthcare professionals and patients. So this close proximity to the hospital and clinical environment had a direct effect on shaping their professional identity, whether they were ready for that or not. And as a result, even social spaces in the building, like the cafe, some students felt like they needed to restrict their conversations, and they were fearful of being negatively judged. So here I wanted to make sure students had a space away from patients and staff, and I also made sure this was an interprofessional space for students rather than it being, a nursing student lounge or a doctor's lounge, to try and encourage those informal learning moments amongst the other professions as we discussed a little last week. So why does any of this matter? Well, here's a few ideas for you to think about. So physical spaces for education can both enable and inhibit learning, whether this learning be part of the formal, informal, or hidden curriculums. Physical space can also create inequities and exclusions. Space impacts the type of teaching strategies we can use. And spaces of formal education, like labs, sim centers, lecture halls, conference rooms, including both their design and their location, can even contribute to how our students are socialized. And learners' experience of space is also important to their educational experience and beyond. For example, in the Hawick article, space and location of the medical school made a lot of students feel isolated. And students' practicum placements can even impact whether they want to work at that hospital upon graduation. So that's a pretty substantial concern for anyone who works in a managerial role. So anyone who's planning or evaluating a learning space may want to consider involving students. And as we wrap this up, I have a few questions for you to reflect on. Where does teaching and learning occur in your own educational or professional context? So is it occurring only in a classroom? In your context, what are some factors pertaining to space that can impact teaching and learning? How about place? And more broadly, how can space and place impact how and what we teach? How can it influence our teaching strategies?